When the fighting in Vietnam finally stopped in 1975, it felt like the end of a really long, brutal chapter in world history. But here's the thing. For Vietnam and the United States, the end of the war was actually the start of two completely different journeys, two legacies that are still playing out even today. And to really get a feel for what both sides were up against, you just have to look at the sheer human cost. The writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez put it so starkly. This quote, it just captures the absolute devastation waiting for Vietnam when the dust settled. This wasn't just about politics or who won or lost. It was this deep collective trauma that scarred pretty much everyone involved. And that's really the key here, right? 1975 wasn't an endpoint. It was a starting pistol for two totally different storylines. For Vietnam, it became a story about literal survival, rebuilding a country from rubble. And for the US, it was a story about a different kind of rebuilding, a psychological and political one. All right, so first up, let's dive into Vietnam's story. I mean, it's hard to even imagine. The nation was in absolute ruins, facing this challenge that must have seemed completely impossible. How do you come back from that? This timeline really maps out an incredible comeback story. So in 75, the country is just shattered. As many as 3 million Vietnamese were dead, a huge number of them men. This created a massive gender imbalance, what they called a marriage squeeze, where there literally weren't enough men for women to marry. And of course, the economy was a wreck. But then something pretty remarkable starts to happen. In 1986, the government rolls out these huge economic reforms called Doi Moi, which means renovation. And this was the big gamble, the real game changer. Think about it. This is a communist government that just fought a devastating war to defend its ideology. And now they're pivoting. They start moving toward a market economy, getting rid of price controls, breaking up state monopolies. It was a massive, risky move. And you can see just how much that gamble paid off right here. I mean, look at these numbers. It's just staggering. In 1990, nearly 60% of the population was living in poverty. But just 16 years later, after those reforms took hold, that number craters to just 16%. Vietnam literally pulled itself up from the ashes. Okay, so that's Vietnam's story, an incredible comeback. Now let's switch gears and look at the United States, where the story is, well, completely different. For America, the end of the war didn't kick off a national building project. Instead, it was like the conflict came home to roost, leaving these deep scars on the national psyche. First off, the price tag was just astronomical. In today's money, we're talking nearly $1 trillion. And all that spending, without raising taxes to cover it, just poured fuel on the fire of inflation that was already roaring in the US during the 1970s. But the cost wasn't just in dollars and cents. The war created this cultural phenomenon that people started calling the Vietnam syndrome. It was this deep, deep hesitation as a country to get involved in wars overseas. That feeling of failure, the bitter fights at home, and a huge loss of trust in the government, that shaped American foreign policy for decades. But even with all that political fallout and economic turmoil, the deepest wounds, the ones that really lingered, they weren't on a national scale. They were personal. They were carried home by the men and women who actually fought there. And the numbers here, wow, they really tell the story. Almost 50 years later, the rate of probable PTSD for someone who isn't a veteran is about 2%. For vets who served but not in Vietnam, it's a bit higher, 4.5%. But for the veterans who served in the Vietnam theater, that number explodes to over 18%. For so many of them, the war never, ever ended. And it goes beyond just PTSD. More than a third of those theater vets have struggled with depression at some point in their lives. Over 10% still deal with serious psychological distress. These aren't old scars that have faded. They're active, persistent wounds. And what's more, the burden isn't shared equally. The data shows that Hispanic and Black veterans have faced even higher rates of these mental health challenges. So you might think, okay, what caused this? Was it being drafted versus volunteering, or what branch you were in? But the research shows something else. The things that really predicted long-term mental health were a veteran's physical health and their total lifetime exposure to trauma, not just in the war, but after, too. It was more about what happened to them than the specific details of how they served. So what we have are these two incredibly different legacies born from the exact same war. So what does all this mean today? How do these two nations, linked by this one brutal conflict, move forward. While, believe it or not, the relationship itself has gone through its own transformation. 20 years after the war ended, in 1995, the US and Vietnam officially reestablished diplomatic relations. And today, these two former enemies actually have a pretty cooperative relationship, working together to balance out other powers in that part of the world. So when you boil it all down, you're left with this incredible split-screen view. For Vietnam, the legacy of the war is in many ways a story of incredible resilience, of rising from the ashes to build a modern economy. But for America, the legacy is one of a lost war that carved these deep, lasting scars into the country's politics, its culture, and most of all, into the lives of its veterans. So, here we are, half a century later. The battles on the ground are long over, but you can see the stories, the legacies, they're still being written every day. And it kind of leaves you with this one big question to chew on. How does the way a nation remembers a war end up shaping everything it becomes later on?